as in fact it does. It does. Yeah, yeah. It sure does.
That drive to Paris. And I got to tell you, it was so moving to know that. Chuck was talking about great services, so thank you for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right, everybody, thank you for being here. My name's Les Morgan. I'm a life member of the Chatham American Legion and the Chatham VFW and the chairman of the Chatham Veterans Memorial. And we're here to pay tribute to Roy Sumpter today, who was killed 98 years ago today. So I'm going to turn it over to Megan Harmon, the local Chatham historian at the Chatham Library. Megan?
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Megan Harmon with the Chatham Area Public Library, and this has been an amazing thing to be a part of, and thank you so much for coming here today. How this all started was Josh here, all the way from Texas, wound up posting a picture of the Caldwell School and said, "Where is this plaque?" Because the Caldwell School burned down in 1964, and he wanted to know if this plaque survived this fire. So we put out a call, and it's just been amazing for me to see all the work that we have. Opal Lee, who collected all these historical photos, and all the work from volunteers who scanned these photos so that I can search them easily and easily send them to Josh and say, hey, here's your grandpa, here's your great-grandma. It's just been amazing. And to finally, almost a year after Josh first reached out, we found this plaque and we put it back on the square where it should be. And it's so wonderful to have Chatham history come to life like that. So without further ado, I'll give you Josh.
Hey, well, thank you, and really I want to thank, there's three individuals that really deserve thanks on this. Christina, obviously, for putting us in contact. Christina's in charge, for putting us in contact, and then Sarge for actually locating the plaque, and then Megan for doing so much hard work in finding this. You know, I'm from Texas, my family's from South Texas, and I set foot in Chatham for the first time just 6 weeks ago, but I've known about Chatham all my life because my grandfather grew up here, my maternal grandfather, and so the Sumpters and the Sabin families are my mother's people. And I've known about Roy Sumpter, Corporal Roy Sumpter, all my life too, and there's a family story about him, and this is all that I knew about him for years and years. I knew that he died in World War I. I knew that he was my great-grandfather's little brother. And the story is that, and there was a house, which I don't believe exists, somewhere down Walnut, where he spent his high school years and then left for the war. And the story is that on November 6, 1918, on the day that he died, his mother, Sarah Ramsey Sumpter, was in the kitchen, and I guess there was a cornfield out there at that point, and she saw a man out in the cornfield, and she walked out, and I've heard that this has gone through the family for years, and she walked out to find out who was out in the field, and it was Roy, and he was wounded very badly, and he held his arms out to her, and he said, "Mother," and she fainted. And when they brought her to, she told him that her son had been killed. And of course, it took weeks at that point for the news to reach the family from France, but he had in fact died. He was an artilleryman in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, and for those of you who want to join us at the Chatham Library after this, I'm going to give a short talk on what that battle was like and why it mattered. But the bottom line is that it was and still is the largest battle in American history. 1.2 million Americans fought in the Meuse-Argonne, and it's a number that hasn't been equaled since or before. And he was a light artilleryman with the 33rd Prairie Division, 124th Field Artillery. It was a division of almost entirely Illinois men. And the story is that he was badly wounded, and as he was being carried back on a stretcher, a shell burst overhead and killed him and the stretcher bearers as well. And so he is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, off in France. And so for those of you who have an opportunity to go to France, I ask you to visit him. He was visited for the first time in almost a century by a friend of mine just last year. So I want to close with this, and there's two things that I would like Chatham to know and you all to know about this guy. The first is that Roy Sumpter was a volunteer. You know, Illinois was pretty unique among the states in that in World War I, 56% of the Illinois men who served were actually volunteers. The majority did not have to be drafted. They signed up to serve. But he wasn't just a volunteer for the war. On June 28th, 1916, over a year, almost a year before America entered the First World War, the Secretary of War put out a call for volunteers to actually go to the Mexican border to defend against disorder down there. Roy Sumpter's enlistment date is actually June 29th, 1916, the day after. He heard the call and he went the day after. And he didn't have to go. I mean, he's here. He was here in Chatham, had a great life. I mean, why would you walk away from this, especially on a day like today? But he did, and he chose to because he had that civic spirit. And I think that's really important. And the final thing that I would like Chatham to know, and there's a reason that you know, it didn't even occur to me, and I didn't ask to, you know, take this plaque with us. You know, had it been sitting in a box for half a century, but it needs to be up here because this is his town, but also because this is not this memorial, and not just the Roy Sumpter part of it, but all these names here on this memorial are not about what Chatham was, but it's about what Chatham is, and it's about how this part of the country and this heartland, even for those of us down in Texas, matters way beyond this town and this region. And so, you know, you all who've turned out here, I really am so appreciative, and I know that he'll be in good hands with you and your families and your friends and your neighbors coming to see his name. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. All right. Well, I appreciate you all making the time to come. Again, my name is Joshua Treviño. I am the great-great-nephew of Corporal Roy Sumpter of the 124th Field Artillery, 33rd Prairie Division of the American Expeditionary Force, who died in action 98 years ago today in the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne on the Western Front in France. And so, again, let me express my appreciation to all of you for coming out for the unveiling of his memorial in Chatham Square. What I want to talk a little bit here about, since we've talked about Roy, is talk a little bit about actually the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. And so there's going to be a little bit of disconnect because this slideshow is his Mexican border service, but we're going to talk about France the whole time. So while you're looking at these lovely images of South Texas, which is my native country, it's not very picturesque, but we're going to be talking about France, which is sort of picturesque, except when the Germans invade, in which case it's a terrible place. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. And I want to explain in very brief overview, and so this will be a short 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, about what the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne is. The Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, so let me just show of hands real quick. How many people have heard of Gettysburg? Everybody's heard it. So how many people have heard of D-Day? How many people before today heard of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne? Okay, so 2 of you. So that's actually a high proportion of individuals who have heard of this battle. Well, that should change in the general public. And by the way, I hadn't even heard of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne until maybe about a decade ago when I started really trying to investigate what happened to this guy, Roy Sumpter, that I'd heard about all my life as a family member. Every American ought to know what the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne is. It is the largest battle in American military history, the biggest one. There was nothing larger before, and there has been nothing larger since. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne, which lasted from September 26, 1918, till the minute the war ended at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918. So over a period of about 6 weeks, a total of 1.2 million Americans were pulled into the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne. 22 divisions. I've got some stats here, of which 26,000 men were killed. A further near 100,000 were wounded. And I want to emphasize that the quality and the nature of the wounds in this time period was particularly horrific because there was the industrial battlefield, which was in full effect in the First World War, barbed wires, expanding bullets, but also poison gas, which is something that Americans in particular have not had to face meaningfully for a century. And so when you hear about these wounded men, we're talking about wounds in a pre-antibiotic era, a pre-modern medical science era, with poison gas that are especially horrific. And so a substantial proportion of these men were not just shot or hit by shrapnel, but they also were exposed to blister agents that produce the equivalent of burns on the skin, or asphyxiating agents that would effectively dissolve the lungs. And so I just want to emphasize that this was not the glory of battle, certainly that I think a lot of these young men imagined, especially those who volunteered. Most of the casualties that were suffered by the Americans in the Meuse-Argonne actually occurred over a three-week period in mid-October, and we'll talk a little bit about that, because the thick of that 3-week period was actually, the brunt of it was borne
by the Illinoisans, and the Virginians, Marylanders, and New Jerseyers of the Blue and Gray Division, so the 29th and the 33rd Prairie Division, taking the Meuse Heights, which I'll talk about momentarily. 840 planes, over almost 3,000 artillery pieces, and almost 320 of this new invention called the tank that were employed by the Americans in this battle. Of all the casualties suffered by the United States in the First World War, half of them came from the Meuse-Argonne. So when we talk about what Americans suffered and what Americans endured in the First World War, we're actually talking mostly about this one battle. We're talking about the Meuse-Argonne, which was this horrific month plus of suffering, but also heroism on the part of the United States forces. Again, just to talk about the scale of it, throughout the entire battle, the Americans fired more shells, 4 million, than were expended by the Union Army in the entire Civil War. So over 6 weeks, the equivalent artillery weight. Now, if that seems incredible to you, if you expand the scope of comparison to all the Allied armies, Belgian, British, French, even the little Portuguese unit on the Western Front, including the Americans, in the first 3 hours of the offensive, the grand offensive, the all-Allied offensive, they expended more shells than were expended in the entire American Civil War. So this was warfare on a titanic scale, and this is where Roy Sumpter fought. Now, when we look at the names that you see in the Meuse-Argonne, they're names that we recognize, and they're names that we don't recognize we should. And so going through the list of the men who fought and served in this battle, we encounter Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the 42nd Rainbow Division, who who made his mark promising his corps commander that he would either take a hill or all his men would die trying. And upon learning of this, one of the soldiers quoted, "Well, he's a generous son of a bitch, ain't he?" You also have names like George Marshall, who did not directly participate in combat, but Marshall was the man who masterminded the disengagement of the Americans from the San Miguel salient, which had been the battle that unfolded over the summer, and moved an entire army into position at the Argonne, and so distinguished himself as a master of organization and logistics that he set himself up to be effectively the man who won the Second World War for the United States Army. You also see names like George Patton, who discovered in the Meuse-Argonne offensive that he loved the tank and he could figure out ways to work with it, and also distinguished himself in a less auspicious way. Upon finding an American soldier who wasn't advancing fast enough, he took out his shovel and split his head open. And so, different time though. So you'll recall Patton, 30 years later, got into trouble for slapping a soldier in a field hospital. Now, nothing happened to him in the First World War. A generation afterwards, things are a little bit different. And that gets back to the difference in media as well. Nobody was going to hit a lieutenant colonel back in 1918 for doing something like that. We also have men like Alvin York. You all remember Sergeant York, of course, the Tennessee pacifist who realized that there were things worth fighting for and did, and earned the Medal of Honor. Billy Mitchell, who discovered in the Meuse-Argonne that air power could make a difference, and claimed that forever after that was his inspiration for the ideas and the doctrine that led to the creation of the United States Air Force. Now, the fact that the soldiers said they never saw Mitchell's planes didn't quite enter into Mitchell's considerations. We also see guys in the Meuse-Argonne like Captain Harry Truman, who's a battery commander, who on the day the battle started called his men together and told them, just remember, there's nowhere else I'd rather be than with you right now. And displayed the fortitude and the courage that even though he went back to Missouri after that battle, was a haberdasher for many years, chasing the love of his life, Bess, who wouldn't marry him for a long, long time. That was where he showed who he was and brought that character to the fore as president over 35 years later. We also see men like Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who fought in the infantry in this battle, making his father, President Roosevelt, former President Roosevelt, very, very proud, even as his brother, Quentin Roosevelt, is shot down and killed, breaking his father's heart and contributing indirectly to his death 2 years later in 1920. And then finally we have men like Ernest Wentmore. Ernest Wentmore is a name that we don't know, but we should. Ernest Wentmore was an Ohio farm boy who, when war was declared, was so excited that he tried to find a unit that would take him. And he got on a train and applied to unit after unit until he found one in Pennsylvania that would take him. And he went to war and he fought with the Pennsylvanians. And Ernest Wentmore was engaged in savage hand-to-hand combat in the Meuse-Argonne, and was eventually wounded severely by shrapnel, and also gassed very, very badly. And he exhibited such valor that he was actually recommended for the Medal of Honor, which he did not end up receiving. But that's how extraordinary he was. He was 13 years old. Yeah. So I want to set the stage for what was going on when the Meuse-Argonne kicks off. America, of course, declares war on Germany in April 1917, and I'll put in a bit of an editorial comment of my own. Next year is going to be the centennial of that declaration of war, and so here at the Chatham Library, we're marking it a bit early, probably for the first time in the country. But one thing I want to emphasize is that World War I gets sort of a bad rap, and it deserves it. But I say a bad rap in the sense that there's a sense that it wasn't worth fighting. It wasn't worth fighting to the extent that, say, the Second World War was. And I want to dispel that myth. For the Americans, and I'm only talking about the Americans, the First World War was a war worth fighting. And we fought the First World War for the same reason we fought a lot of other wars throughout history. Well, there are two principal causes, just to refresh. First was freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation, which Imperial Germany decided to threaten, and that is historically a casus bellum for us, going all the way back to President Adams, President Jefferson. That is something America fights for. And the second reason was that the Germans actually did conspire with the Mexicans with the Zimmermann telegram, which I hope you're all familiar with, but in brief, the Germans were trying to entice Mexico to invade the United States, which was a much more real and plausible danger in that era than we properly appreciate now. There's a reason this guy was on the Mexican border in 1916, 1917, because there in fact was a real Mexican military threat back then. And because it's one of my hobbies, but I think most people find it quite boring, but I'm happy to talk to any of you afterwards about that if you want. So all of which is to say, we went to war for the right reason. We went to the war for the reasons that America has historically gone to war. In doing that, and entering in 1917, we entered a war in which the combatants in general were fairly exhausted, but the Allies in particular were almost on their last legs. At the beginning of 1918, the Russians had essentially dropped out of the war, and Germany had effectively won the war on the Eastern Front, leaving the Germans with the ability to actually move the bulk of their divisions and their very experienced combat forces, and they were qualitatively probably the best army in the world at that point, over to the Western Front to deal the knockout blow to the British and the French. And in the spring of 1918, they made a lot of headway with a series of offensives, the Ludendorff offensives, Operation Michael, in spring of 1918, that really pushed the Allies to the limits in that theater. And so the Allies, the British and the French in particular, viewed the Americans as a reservoir of two things, of manufacturer material, but also of men. What they didn't believe the Americans do was fight on their own. They didn't think that the Americans had the leadership qualities or the experience to fight effectively on the Western Front. And certainly the Americans didn't have the benefit of everything that the British and the French had been through since August 1914. And so the press from the Allies on the Americans was, let us use your men. As soon as you train Americans, go ahead and feed them into our units. And so their idea was that the Americans would form effectively a vast manpower reserve to fight under British and French direction. And so their concept is that you would see American platoons, companies, and brigades actually fighting as part of British and French divisions, essentially to stand in for their manpower losses. Fortunately, General Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, had a very different idea, and Washington backed him up. And he said, we're going to fight as an independent American army only, and on an American front on the Western Front. And this caused a lot of friction, but he was backed up, partly out of patriotic feeling. So Americans did, I want to be clear, some Americans did in fact fight under foreign command in the First World War. The Marines at Belleau Wood being the very famous example, who actually fought ultimately under French command. The Americans in Italy were also under I think they were under British command. And then there were American units attached to both British and French commands throughout the entirety of the war. But the overwhelming majority of the Americans slowly collected in France, following a period of training in 1917, starting with the transshipment of the gigantic 1.2 million strong army in early 1918 to France, and they collected as the American First Army. And the American First Army went ahead and was assigned the Meuse-Argonne Sector. Now, we don't have a map handy with the Meuse-Argonne Sector, but I want you to imagine effectively the line stretching from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. And the Meuse-Argonne is almost as far to the east as you can go. So when you're looking at the map on your right-hand side, you've got the Meuse-Argonne there. And here's why it's important. So there's two reasons. The reasons the Americans got this particular sector is because it was regarded as one of the worst places to be. And it was. It was one of the worst places to be. It was next door to Verdun. And so Verdun, I know you know what happened at Verdun. So Verdun, where a year and a half before, 2 years before, excuse me, the French and the Germans had expended 500,000 men in casualties and deaths for exchanging maybe a mile or two of land on either side. It was effectively regarded as an impenetrable sector. One of the reasons it was regarded, there were two reasons it was regarded as impenetrable. One was the forest of Argonne, which is a very dense, and still is today, a very dense forest marked by a lot of ravines, a lot of cliffs, a lot of thickets, a lot of swamps, and it's very difficult to get through. And the other reason was a feature called the Heights of the Meuse, which is actually a series of bluffs overlooking the Meuse River, from which dominate the landscape for miles around. And the Germans held the heights of the Meuse, and so it was near impossible to advance in the MeuseArgonne sector without coming under direct fire from the heights of the Meuse. Now, the Germans were dependent upon one big thing above all else for sustaining their war effort on the Western Front, and it was rail access to the entirety of the front. And they had constructed a main military line all the way from Germany, essentially to the sea. And so this line extended pretty far behind the front, except in the Meuse-Argonne. Went right behind the heights of the Meuse, which is one reason the Germans defended it so heavily. It was never taken. And so when it came time to launch the big Allied offensive at the end of the war, once the Germans had expended themselves and the American First Army is in place and the tide starts to turn in the summer of 1918, the Allies agree that starting at the end of August and then leading into September, and again September 26th is when the Meuse-Argonne offensive kicks off, that they're going to go on a general offensive on the Western Front. And the Germans react like this because they are now numerically outnumbered. They understand that they're outnumbered in material, but they're able to trade space for time. And they're also outstanding fighters. I mean, there's no question about it. Outstandingly led, well officered, good men. And so as the British in particular attack along the line, the Germans respond by just giving up territory very dearly. And they've got territory to surrender too. So it doesn't significantly affect Germany's strategic position that they're losing ground on Picardy or along the Aisne or anywhere else. There's only one place where the Germans cannot give ground, and it's the Meuse-Argonne. They can't do it. It's impossible for them to do it because it will cut the rail line that's at Sedan just north of the heights of the Meuse, and it will end the war. That's where the Americans attack. And so the Americans attack on September 26th, and they go up against, with 22 divisions, they go up against 44 German divisions, twice the number of divisions. Now, I don't want to overstate that. A German division was smaller at that point than an American division was. Nevertheless, this is still a significant imbalance between attacker and attacking. Those of you who have been in the military understand that when you're attacking a position, the rule of thumb is you want at least 2 to 3 times the number of people in defending. Well, in this case, it was almost force on force. And so the general in charge of the German forces was a guy named Gallwitz, and he constructed a series of formidable fortifications, knowing that he could not fall back, that they had to stand or die. And so he constructed fortifications called the Kriemhildestellung, which is a fortress position. And that is where the fight unfolded. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the 33rd Division, because the 33rd Division, along with the 29th Division, which was a mixed force, so the 33rd was Illinois men, the 29th Division was Virginia, Maryland, and I believe New Jersey, and so they called that one the blue and gray divisions. So you had both North and South. That warms my heart. So they were the ones who went hard up against the heights of the Meuse, and I want to read to you how so there's 2 books I brought with me, and I promise I won't read the whole book aloud. But if you want to get one book on the Meuse-Argonne, this is it. So Edward Lengel is the author of this book, To Conquer Hell. He's actually the custodian of George Washington's papers at UVA, so a very good historian. And it's emblematic of the extent to which we as a country have forgotten the Meuse-Argonne, that this is really the only popular history book about the battle out there that's good. There are some others, but as a comprehensive history of this battle, you can't do better than this one. So I strongly urge you to get it. But I want to read to you the Illinoisans' debut in the battle, because they lead with a surprise attack through some of the worst terrain in the Meuse-Argonne. So Lengel writes, the 33rd Prairie Division, Illinois National Guard, reflected the diversity of the state from which it hailed. 2 of the division's 4 regiments, the 129th and 130th, consisted entirely of Midwestern farm boys. By the way, Roy Sumpter was one of those Midwestern farm boys, but Lengel doesn't mention he was in divisional artillery, so that's a very special place to be. The 131st and 132nd Regiments, by contrast, came from Chicago's toughest working class neighborhoods. None of the Prairie Division soldiers had ever seen anything like the pitted, corpse-infested swamp that awaited them on September 26. A marsh oozed around the banks of the Forge Creek that they had to cross. Shell holes filled with dense stews of water, mud, rotten equipment, and human and animal remains, topped with dense coatings of scum and vegetation, pitted the landscape amongst tenuous islands of stringy grass. And by the way, this is the debris of the Verdun battles 2 years before, still there. And so this is already fought over ground, and now they're going to do it again. The French avoided this domain, declaring it impassable, having lost 500,000 men trying to do it. But in the early morning darkness of September 26, 33rd Division engineers ventured into the swamp, scurrying from hole to hole as they laid paths for the infantry to follow at daylight. Led by the Chicagoans, the Prairie Division advanced into the fog and smoke-covered swamp, separating into 9 columns. The Germans had not expected the Americans to attempt to cross the creek, and they were shocked to find that the entire skyline was dotted with angry, mud-covered farm boys. So they rout the Germans, and at the end of it, the Prairie Division had met its objective for the day, which was to capture the westward bend of the Meuse as a prelude to advancing to the heights of the Meuse. With the German counterattack unlikely, the Illinoisans scraped the mud from their uniforms, sampled seized provisions that they dubbed canned Wilhelm, and wandered through the captured German dugouts. And the dugouts they found were fitted with electric lights, telephones, bunkheads, and stoves. This is how long they'd been here. This is how heavily fortified it was. All the comforts of home. But their biggest concern was the artillery on the heights of the Meuse. The enemy guns never stopped firing. And so the Illinoisans do this, and on September 26, and then on October 6, they launched the assault on the heights of the Meuse. And so they and the 29th Division actually end up taking the heights. There's a wonderful, and I couldn't find it in time for this talk, but there's a wonderful New York Times article that actually just came out a couple of years ago in which a New York Times reporter actually goes to the battlefield and asks these elderly Frenchmen, you know, who got the Germans out of this place, and all of them say only the Americans could do it. So we tried for 4 years, only the Americans could do it, and it was because they were wild. It's because they were out of their minds, and so that's kind of the European take on the Americans. So this is from the Second World War, not the First, but there's a joke that goes around that the Germans, and so this is from a debrief, if I'm remembering correctly, of a German officer after the Second World War who ended up fighting the Russians, the British, and the Americans, and he said he liked fighting the British because the British would do exactly what their doctrine said to do. And he liked fighting the Russians because the Russians would do what their doctrine said to do, but they wouldn't do it well. But he hated fighting the Americans because the Americans never followed their own rule books. And that goes way back to the First World War. So these men, taken from the Illinois National Guard and reorganized from the men that you see here in 1st Illinois Cav, effectively they took the heights of the Meuse. And once the heights of the Meuse were taken, then it was almost impossible for the Germans to defend the final approach to Sedan. And the rail line was cut at Sedan in the final 10 days of October, and at that point, the war was effectively over. The Germans could not sustain, logistically, an effort without the rail line leading to their armies further west. And so at that point, the war was done. Now, the Americans didn't win their war on their own, but it's very difficult to imagine the war ending as it did without that first American army clambering through and cutting that line. I want to read one more passage because I think this, by the way, is the Illinois Blue Book from 1919-1920, which contains, so this is effectively the state government yearbook, and there's a big section in here about what Illinois did in World War I, and I want to read one passage because I think it really rings true. And so again, keep in mind this is published in 1920. It says, "The record of Illinois at home and overseas during the period of the Great World War is one which every citizen of Illinois may be justly proud. Our boys gloriously sustained the record of the state of Illinois for intrepid bravery and intense loyalty. So long as time shall last, the inspiration of their supreme sacrifice shall be with the living. The men from Illinois who were with Lincoln in the Black Hawk War, with Taylor at Buena Vista, with Crockett at the Alamo, with Grant at Vicksburg, with Sheridan in the Shenandoah, and in so many other places, were the stuff of which heroes are made. The soldier of Illinois of 1918 at home or abroad was a fitting demonstration that our progenitors have bred true. The bravery displayed on the field of battle by Illinois forces overseas combined to make us all proud to be citizens of a state like Illinois. Amiens, Hamel, Chapelly Ridge, Gressart Wood, Bois des Forges, Saint-Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne, Verdun, and a score of other desperate battlefields in France tell the story of Illinois heroism. In none of these battles did the troops from Illinois fail to take an objective when assigned, nor fail to take it on the scheduled time. When one contemplates the record of our troops, we may truly with becoming modesty say, not without thy wondrous story, Illinois, can be writ the nation's glory. And Illinois did step up. I mentioned at the memorial today that 56% of the Illinois soldiers who fought in the war were volunteers. They did not have to be drafted. And interestingly enough, back home here, the state also stepped up. The Illinois harvest in 1918, I actually didn't know this until very recently, the Illinois harvest in 1918, spurred on by war organization efforts, was the largest, in monetary value, was the largest state harvest by any state in American history up to that point. It's been exceeded since then. But they, with their manpower taken out and sent abroad to participate in the war, they still turned in the biggest harvest that any American state had ever seen. An extraordinary record. So last thing I want to read you, and I'll close the talk with this, and then I'm happy to take questions, and hopefully I can answer them. Well, hang on, there was one thing I wanted to read to you guys. Here we go. So I want to end with this. I want to end what it was like for the average soldier. This was such a gigantic battle, largest in American history, and it effectively won the war for us, for the Allies. But men like Roy Sumpter, Corporal Sumpter, and tens of thousands of others died doing it. And their experience of it, we valorize them, and they deserve our honor. But at the same time, they went through a horrific experience and a genuinely hellacious experience, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And so I want to read two things to you real quick, and these are soldiers' recollections. This is from a fellow named Corporal Frank Schmidt, who survived the war, and so he's writing home in December 1918, a few weeks after the war ends, and he writes to his dad, and he says, "Dear father, our biggest conflict took place in the Argonne forest, where a man's life wasn't worth a nickel. Father, I have seen death in every shape and form during my 7 months over here, imaginable, and I have been and seen places I shudder every time I think of them. And I've learned what a home and life really means. And when I get back, you can wager I will be a home-loving man." And then the last thing is Ernest Rentmore, the 13-year-old I told you about. He's the youngest soldier in American service. And by the way, he did lie about his age, in case you're wondering. So they didn't know he was 13. When he's recovering from getting gassed and getting shrapnel in his legs, this is what he writes. He's writing about himself in the third person, by the way, because this is from his memoirs later on. "There was no glory. Instead, the war brought to him a wounded body and memories of sights that will always cause heartaches and tears. It brought him hardship and exposure beyond man's conception, hunger, cold, and sleepless nights, the sight of mangled bodies of friends and buddies, the knowledge of desolation, and the sorrow and agony that is the aftermath of war. It left him with memories that can never be erased, memories that bring again and again visions of an eternity spent in a hell on earth." And so I'll close with this. We should remember the MeuseArgonne because it's the centennial, and because we as citizens have a duty to know the history. But we should also remember it because they went through these things, and they did it for us. And the charge upon us is not just to remember them, but to live as citizens deserving of the things that they secured. So thank you very much. And thank you so much to Chatham Library for doing this. I really am so grateful to you guys. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks, everybody.